the famous supercar burnout. And although it's not the smartest trick in the world to do, certainly not the sort of thing you ever do on a public road, it's pretty indicative of the sort of power that supercars, as such, produce. Well, what is a supercar? It may be a good question at this time. 2 or 3 years ago, when cars began to become more and more involved in the power race, 2 or 3 cars crept onto the Australian market which were labelled supercars by the motoring press and, in fact, ultimately by the people themselves. The supercars are the high-powered sports performance machines designed primarily for racing. And let me just explain that. Originally, the intention was that these cars should be used for motor racing, but to comply with the eligibility clauses of the Confederation of Australian Motorsport, a certain number had to be produced and sold to the public. Hence, they were developed as road cars. In truth, they're not very good road cars. They are much too powerful, much too lively, much too high performance. This car is the newest in the line of chargers from Chrysler. And it's not a supercar because it's not built for racing, but my heavens, it's awfully close to it. It now has the biggest of the Australian-made V8s in it, 360 cubic inches. It's got in the vicinity of 300 brake horsepower, and it is, by anybody's language, a big, strong, powerful motor car. The greatest single difficulty about supercars is their fantastic rate of acceleration. And if you imagine that, from stoplight to stoplight in the city, from intersection to intersection, they gather up an enormous amount of speed. And on the country roads, from corner to corner, the same sort of thing, the surge forward, and by the time you arrive at the next corner, you're in a certain amount of difficulty because you've got to slow it right down, get it all set up, steadied, under control, back into shape again. For some people, that rate of acceleration and that speed of entry into corners presents problems. And simply as a result of lack of experience and lack of feel for high-performance motor cars, it is in that realm that the people who drive supercars are likely to get themselves into trouble. It requires a great deal of concentration and feel on that rate of acceleration. There it goes again, a car moving away very fast, gathering up the speed before the next corner, very quickly indeed. You've got to set up, brake, steady, and then when you get in, you are at limit type motoring. The car is actually fighting, and you are looking for control all the way around, tucking in, and it's working very hard. And changes of direction are difficult because it's big and heavy and cumbersome, and it doesn't want to change direction. Now, if you're going to drive such a car, would you keep those things in your mind? It will take you by surprise. It will arrive at the corner going faster than you wanted it to. It will get from point to point, intersection to intersection, traffic light to traffic light at a much faster rate than anything you've ever driven before. Control it, and it stops being a problem. Let it get the better of you, and you're in plenty of trouble. This is the super part of the Chrysler Valiant 770 Charger. 360 cubic inches of huge iron V8, and that's not everybody's piece of cake. Simply these days, on the basis of the fact that it's going to use lots of petrol and it's going to pump lots of pollutants into the atmosphere. However, there are other things about motor cars to be considered, and particularly where you start to get that sort of performance, handling and braking become, well, perhaps even more critical than they do in the car that's going to be used by the ordinary consumer. In this case, the handling is definitely better than any other Valiant I've ever driven, very largely because it's the sort of Charger sports package type car, and it's a bit firmer than the ordinary machine. Nevertheless, it's still fairly heavily understeers, and it still wallows about, and it's still difficult to get to change direction. Now, that's not necessarily worse than a lot of other similar motor cars, but it certainly is not good. It is throttle controllable, however. It's got a good tendency to feed back off the throttle into a characteristic that you would want. So if things do get out of shape a bit, you can bring it back online again by just dropping off the power and starting all over again. The brakes I could only describe as being inadequate, and particularly for a car of this performance. One stop from 70 kilometres per hour, and the car lost quite a degree of directional stability, which is understandable. Again, no pressure limiting device on the back wheels. But more alarming still, 3 hard stops from 100 kilometres per hour, and we had no brakes at all, which is a bit of a disaster. And I can only think, since the car has got front discs, that the reasons are quite simply that the wheels, 7-inch mag wheels, shroud the brakes too much to allow sufficient cooling air to keep the temperatures down, or alternatively, that the pad material that's used is the same material that might have been used on the car in its absolutely standard form. That is, by the time you get to the high-performance version, they are inadequate. Either way, I wouldn't like them to be the brakes on my car because I wouldn't feel safe with them. Well, we've run into some rain, and if ever a car with this sort of power needed due care and caution, it needs it under these circumstances. It is just terribly easy to get the car to break traction at the back wheels, and one needs extra finesse and care. And particularly when one is surrounded by other cars and other traffic, such as we would be under normal city driving circumstances. While we're on that subject, the car really is more image than practical. 2 doors, which are okay for some people, but not my piece of cake. I like to be able to let people in and out of the back seat without having to move my seats. And appearance rather than functionability, to the extent, for example, that the boot is just stupid, nothing more or less. It's a lid which opens directly without exposing any of the rear of the car, so that where I've commented before about having to lift things over the tailgate, in this case you've got to lift them right over the back of the motor car. There's a foot or so of leaning forward to put things into the boot. That's pretty silly, and it's just the sort of image thing with that little high swept tailgate that this sort of car has. Otherwise, however, typical V8 smoothness. It really does flow along very nicely if you don't abuse it. It's got an excellent gearbox, the floor shift, which you can use manually or which you can simply allow to make its own shifts. The seating position is good, there's no question about it, and I'm commenting about that particularly because Valiants previously, and especially the Charger, have had very bad seating positions where in fact you've almost had to sit on the floor, sort of down here with your hands up high in the air. They've lifted the seat quite substantially and you now get a good line of vision across the bonnet, but in doing so they've changed the degree of comfort somewhat because they've made the seat and squab convex in shape rather than concave, so you sit upon the seat rather than within the seat, and for that reason it doesn't hold you in place very well, and you're not helped very much by these retractor seat belts, which are an impact lock belt. You can't make it lock by giving it a good tug. It needs to be hit, literally, and that worries me a little bit. I'm not terribly happy about them. And the second thing about the seat belts is that they tend to rub across the side of your neck because they have not allowed the drop loop, which normally would bring the seatbelt down across your shoulder. Little things that I think the designers ought to be thinking about. We've been on the same subject before. We are on it again with an Australian motor car that has potential, but which has not yet developed to the extent that would make it functional from everybody's point of view, and especially not as a town carriage. Have you ever thought of what 300 horsepower would look like if they were real horses? Imagine yourself with 6 rows of horses out front of you and that those rows go on for 50 rows forward. Nearly a quarter of a mile of horses pulling the car along. That's what it amounts to, 300 horsepower. It's silly, of course, but just try and conceive of that sort of situation and you'll know what's under the bonnet of this sort of motor car. That's the only point about this car that really worries me. It is pleasant to drive, there's no question about it. Quite a nice long-distance touring car, quite pleasant in town with its automatic transmission. But it doesn't need 360 cubic inches of engine. And as I see it, that's the problem in itself because it just does move too quickly from point to point.